There are massive updates in the compound tirzepatide and compound semaglutide world. One of them is an exclusive story from On the Pen, and another widely underreported story. And we're going to get into all of that and more on today's episode of On the Pen, the Weekly Dose podcast. Welcome back.
Welcome to the On the Pen podcast with your host, Dave Knapp.
Welcome back to the Weekly Dose podcast. And if you are somebody who relies on compound medications, this is the podcast for you. There is so much news potentially impacting the future accessibility of these peptides, and we're going to get into all of it. But before we do, would you hit the like bell and the subscribe button? But make sure if you're watching this on YouTube that you go down to the description of this video and hit the hype button, HYPE. Yeah, hype is a new feature that YouTube has allowed us to have here that helps us to trend in the algorithm. And you can do that up to 3 times. Just go to the hype button and hit hype, and then go back and do it 2 other times. You get 3 per week. And we hope that you'll use them all on today's podcast to help get the word out about what we're doing here at On the Pen, a podcast that drops every Tuesday. And we only can bring you this podcast because of our sponsors at Shed. So if you're somebody who lives with the disease of obesity and you felt flat out shut out by your primary care provider, get connected with the providers at Shed, who can walk you through all of the implications of the medications that are out there on the market to treat the chronic and relapsing disease of obesity. They'll treat you as a patient. They'll treat you individualized. So depending on what your needs are, they can connect you with medicine when appropriate. And I hope that you'll check them out and use code OTP25 to save 25% off of your obesity care at tryshed.com. Again, that's code OTP25, save your 25%, and thank them for sponsoring this podcast and bringing it to us each and every week. So I've already recorded this thing once, and this was some breaking news today that I got from our friend over on X, Jen Knoosh. But there's a ton going on in the world of compounds. And last week, we brought you a exclusive story at obesity.news. That's our newsletter. If you're not signed up for our newsletter, what are you doing with your life? You've watched 100 podcasts and you're not signed up for our newsletter. Go to obesity.news in your browser and then put your email address in, because I'm actually starting to believe that compound semaglutide could be added to the FDA's DDC list. If you don't know what that is, we'll fly over it here in a second. But ultimately, what does that mean? I believe that compound semaglutide could go away, like completely. And I believe that certain types of compound tirzepatide could be right behind it. This is a pressure cooker right now, and there's so much information. Let's go to the exclusive story that I have first, though. This is the story about compound semaglutide. So we know that Eli Lilly and Novo Nordisk have both been working sort of in tandem with the FDA to get their drugs added, tirzepatide and semaglutide. Sorry, I'm going back and forth on the semaglutide and semaglutide. I know I do that and it drives people nuts. But the DDC list, what is it? Well, it's a list that the FDA maintains called the Demonstrable Difficulty to Compound list. And the DDC list is basically drugs that are considered so complex to formulate that pharmacies can't reliably reproduce them safe and effectively. The first argument that I'm sure that we'll hear on this is we've had these all through the shortages. We'll get there because there's plenty of holes to poke in the arguments that are being made and plenty of questions to be asked about the timing and validity of all of this. But there's also a pretty compelling case being laid out by pharma right now that is hard to ignore if you're somebody who wants access to safe and effective versions of these medications. I think we have to pay attention to these. So there was a document that I recently uncovered here and On the Pen. It's been reported nowhere else in the mainstream media. Nowhere. I don't even think it's been reported anywhere else. But this was a document from January 12th of this past year. It was a regulatory filing submitted by Novo Nordisk to the FDA that is a technical supplement to the company's petition to the FDA to have semaglutide added to the DDC list. But buried inside of it is a collection of laboratory findings that they came up with that could reshape this entire debate over compounded semaglutide. Now, I want to zoom out really quickly, and without getting too detailed into the science, one of the unique arguments that Novo Nordisk has that Lilly doesn't have is that semaglutide is manufactured from what's called a recombinant yeast-based process. Now, that's not going to mean a lot to most people, but essentially what it means to us is that Novo manufactures this peptide using a fermentation-based process, excuse me, that involves genetically engineered microorganisms that produce the peptide. Compounded versions of semaglutide begin with a chemical synthesization process that manufactures the API. So the manufacturing process of making semaglutide is different between Novo Nordisk and the compounders. Lilly doesn't have that same argument, but they do have a new and very interesting argument that I think that we should get into. So my hope in sharing all of this today, again, is not to fearmonger. It's not to placate to industry, whether that's pharma or compound. It's simply to advocate for you as patients to know where this whole thing sits and where I think that it's moving. So with that as the backdrop, let's talk about what Novo Nordisk found and what was reported in this supplement that they filed. So the company outlines a series of lab analyses that were performed both on semaglutide APIs. That's the active pharmaceutical ingredient. That's like what makes the drug, right? That's what actually mimics your GLP-1 hormone, binds to your receptors. That's the active ingredient in the drug. Okay. And so the really compelling part of this argument here is that Novo actually went to sample these peptide sources, these API sources from FDA green list approved vendors. Now, if you're a longtime listener of On the Pen, you already know what that is. But if you're new to On the Pen, the green list was basically established by the FDA as a way to allow certain foreign made active pharmaceutical ingredients to basically just pass through customs without being detained. So the FDA basically created a list of vendors and said, if a shipment is coming into the United States of drugs and it's from any number of these companies, let it on through. We trust them because we have evidence to suggest that these manufacturers are following the protocol, the current goods and manufacturing process that the FDA has to regulate API. In other words, Novo Nordisk is not claiming in these lab analyses in terms of the API that they come from some obscure research chemical source. It detected them actually in FDA approved green list manufacturers. So what did they find? Well, in their report, they lay out notable impurities that they found. In one case, the company detected roughly 0.46% of an unknown peptide related impurity material sourced from a green list manufacturer. Another sample reportedly contained 0.38% of an unknown peptide impurity with structural peptide alterations involving amino acid additions. It's kind of like changing a word in a sentence that can actually change the whole meaning of the sentence, but in peptide and sciencey form. And a third supplier showed approximately 1.33% of an unknown peptide-related impurity, along with truncated peptide fragments and elevated high molecular weight protein aggregates. All of this is important, according to Novo Nordisk, because these variations can affect how these peptides bind to receptors. They can affect how long it lasts in the body, and most importantly, how the body's immune system responds to it. And these are all things that can be sort of happening underneath the surface without anything, obvious going on from a health standpoint, but over the long term could potentially pose problems for people. So Novo's argument here is that these differences introduce uncertainty that could translate into reduced effectiveness, unexpected side effects, or these immune responses that would not otherwise occur with the manufacturer approved version of semaglutide. Now let's talk about what they found in the actual finished product of compound. So they've got two basically things going on here. You've got them testing API, the active pharmaceutical ingredient that compounders are using. Now we're talking about finished compounded products. Now, what we're not sure of here is we're not certain that these weren't being lumped in with research grade peptides. We're not certain that these came from 503A or 503B regulated facilities. That information was not given to us in this supplement. But based upon what they found here is in one compounded sample, Novo found semaglutide at roughly 302% of the label strength. Now, we see this all the time across research grade peptide world. That's why we don't talk about research grade an awful lot on this channel, because even though there's a lot of people in our community that use them, you can go check out websites like Finric, and you can see that this is commonplace in peptide manufacturing on the research grade market, not for human consumption world. You can see this happen all the time, which is what makes them dangerous. Because when we're talking about drugs like retatrutide, which most people who are taking a GLP-1 from the research grade world are taking Reta, we're talking about a cardiac stimulant. And if you're getting 3 times the dose, that's a scary place to be in. But this is a Novo reporting semaglutide at roughly 302% of the label strength, meaning a patient is ultimately taking 3 times their dose. So imagine that you're dosing up on Ozempic or semaglutide. Like if you've ever used semaglutide, you know it's very harsh, especially at first. If you're going from 0.25 milligrams a week and you think you're going to 0.5, but you actually jump to 1.5 milligrams a week, that can cause people some serious problems. Now, on the other end of the spectrum here, it was also reported that in an oral sublingual tablet, it contained only 0.4% of the labeled semaglutide. So this poor person takes the medication and there's basically no medication in it. So they label themselves a non-responder to the medication because they were unknowingly getting just 4% of what the label said that it had on it. So these are obviously problems for compounders to deal with. But again, we need more specifics, right? The other thing that Novo Nordisk mentioned in this supplement was another compounded injectable product reportedly containing 86.2% peptide-related impurities, including roughly 29% of it being tirzepatide. And tirzepatide-related impurities, despite being labeled as semaglutide. So somebody's taking semaglutide, but they're actually taking semaglutide mixed with tirzepatide. And Novo also reported detecting oxidized peptide fragments, semaglutide aggregates, truncated peptide chains, formaldehyde-related adducts in certain samples. And in some cases, those altered molecules accounted for the majority of what was present in the formulation, suggesting that much of the material in the vial may not have been intact semaglutide at all. Again, we don't know the source, but these are worrisome for the patients that could ultimately be taking these. Now, I think that it's important to stop, collaborate, and listen. It's important to stop here and mention that these types of problems are not necessarily isolated to compounds, right? To just give the other side of the story here. Like, let's talk about Catalent for a second, because Catalent is a company, a generics manufacturer, a pharmaceutical contract manufacturer that was acquired a couple of years ago by Novo Holdings. And then a lot of their finish and fill facilities were sold off to Novo Nordisk. But those finish and fill facilities still own contracts with a lot of drug companies out there. And a specific plant in Bloomington, Indiana has been cited many, many times by the FDA with very recent warning letters. As we previously reported, investigators documented issues ranging from bacterial contamination to pest activity and the presence of atypical foreign particles, including mammalian hair, cat hair contamination found around the vial stoppers. So even though, according to Sue the Dude, Catalent has ended their bring your feline to work day, the mammalian hair remains, and these issues with Catalent continue and persist. The FDA has reported that the facility failed to determine the root causes of these. Apparently it wasn't bring your cat to work day for several contamination events, or assess whether similar issues have affected other production batches. Now, if you don't think that that's a big enough deal, perhaps take a look at the impact across the broader biotech landscape, because this has caused ripple effects throughout all of pharma. In fact, several companies have seen delays with their regulatory timelines. Regeneron and its high-dose version of Eylea. Scholar Rock encountered setbacks tied to manufacturing issues during the review of its spinal muscular atrophy therapy. And very recently, a company called Insight received a complete response letter for its PD-1 inhibitor. It's a drug called Zinase, which is a first-line treatment for small cell lung cancer. And regulators in their response cited inspection findings from Catalent finish and fill facilities as the reason for the rejection of this drug, not any concerns about the drug's clinical efficacy. So the Catalent issues have a wide-ranging cascade of implications across a lot of different types of drugs. So Novo's hands are not clean here. In fact, when we look at what the APC had to say in terms of the Novo Nordisk filing in this DDC list, they essentially said that they're questioning both the evidence Novo presented and the conclusions that they're drawing, basically based upon the samples that were noted in this not necessarily being sourced from 503A or 503B pharmacies. Could they have come from research grade? And also from the compounding industry's perspective, the distinction matters because thousands of pharmacists have legally produced compound semaglutide for years now, and especially during the shortage, millions and millions, probably hundreds of millions of doses at this point. And so the argument there is if they're demonstrably difficult to compound, wouldn't we have seen something surface in the real world rather than this laboratory setting conducted by the actual drug manufacturer who has a vested interest in ending compounds? So these are all valid points brought up by the APC in their response to this filing. Now, all of this is not happening in a vacuum because we see that Eli Lilly is kind of working the same thing from a different angle here, because there was a press release last week that actually ended up being accompanied by a research preprint research paper from Lilly that we've now had the chance to review. And this was flagged by our friend Jen Kanoush over on TikTok, or sorry, X, one of my favorite follows. Again, I think we mention her just about every week here. So what happened here was Lilly releases a paper and says that compound B12 and tirzepatide are uniquely dangerous because of a chemical reaction. And at first it was like, oh, great. Like, why don't you tell us a little bit more, right? Instead of getting people all riled up with no specifics. Well, it turns out there actually are some specifics, and we need to revisit this because my knee-jerk reaction to this was you can't just tell people that this is potentially dangerous and not tell them why. Well, when we look at the preprint paper here, there's a pretty big update. And what they're saying here is that when B12 is combined with tirzepatide, they're not just sitting next to each other in the vial. You're actually getting a chemical reaction between tirzepatide and B12. And specifically, they're seeing what's called an adduct, which means that the tirzepatide molecule and the B12 molecule are actually binding together to form a new structure. Not tirzepatide, not B12, something together and something completely new. And they're saying this happens through a ligand substitution type reaction, which basically means that the B12 is interacting with parts of the tirzepatide molecule, and that changes how it's put together. Now, here's what's interesting. They're saying that the adduct actually made up 10% of the total polypeptide content in the samples that they tested, 10%. So that's not like these trace numbers like we were just referencing in the Novo filing. That's like, hey, we found a meaningful portion of what's in the vial is no longer the original drug that it says on the label. And they're saying that this showed up across med spas, compounding pharmacies, and telehealth sourced products. And so from their perspective, this isn't an isolated issue. It's something that's happening pretty broadly when these two things specifically are combined, tirzepatide and B12. Now, here's the part that I think actually strengthens their case. They didn't just test market samples. They actually made their own formulation of tirzepatide plus B12 under controlled conditions, and they still saw the same thing. They confirmed the formation of this adduct, and they went further using 1D and 2D NMR spectroscopy, which basically means a very detailed way of mapping out the molecular structure of the peptide. And the scans showed that there were these structural changes to their tirzepatide molecule. Now, why does that matter to a patient? Here's what it means in reality. The structure determines how it binds to your receptors, right? So you have kind of like a lock and key situation. your receptor is the lock, and tirzepatide comes along as the key, and they bind together, and that, sets off a cascade of reactions. Now, when these two combine together, it changes the key. And so it doesn't bind to the receptor the same way. So it can change how well it works. It can change how long it lasts, and it can change how long that how the body actually responds to the molecule. And some of these changes may affect the region responsible for receptor binding, which isn't a small claim. It's basically saying this could alter efficacy and potentially safety. Now, this still doesn't answer everything because now it sort of begs a lot more questions. Is this harmful at those levels? Does it meaningfully reduce efficacy? Are patients actually experiencing issues in the real world because of this? Those are all questions to be asked. My other question would be, are other compounds being mixed with tirzepatide doing the same thing? I'm also curious how long Lilly's known about this too, if this poses a risk for patients. Like, how long has this been on their radar? So I think this is no longer just like a press release from Lilly. There's some actual science going on here. But what does it mean for patients? And I think that is what remains to be seen, and what we'll need to continue to keep an eye on, track, and report here at On the Pen, which is all the more reason to make sure that you hit the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube. Give the podcast a little bump by giving us a 5-star rating and review on your Apple or Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts, because ultimately at the end of the day, we're trying to train the algorithm to feed us more of the content that we love. Now, finally on the podcast, I want to shift to a little bit brighter tone, because we got some phase 2 data from Structure Therapeutics this week that I think is pretty exciting if you're watching the space. Not necessarily in terms of the drug that they're testing being some massive breakthrough, but in terms of additional options, additional companies getting into the game here. Now, this is one that we've talked about before. The name of the molecule itself is alaniglipron. And so you hear that suffix glipron. We hear that too in orforglipron. So this is another small molecule GLP-1. And this has phase 2 data. So we're looking at around 16% placebo-adjusted weight at 44 weeks. We're looking at around 16.2% weight loss in an open label extension that went on another few weeks, 56 weeks. Over 90% of the patients on alaniglipron saw greater than 10% weight loss at the higher doses, and around 60% hit greater than 15% weight loss. So these are huge numbers for an oral GLP-1. There's a lot of interesting information to unpack here, and we're going to try to do it quick here before we round the podcast out. There was only a 3.7% discontinuation rate at the higher dose in a re-randomized group, which is pretty low, around 2% in the OLE. There were, most importantly, I think, no liver signals. And you're going to see why I think that's important, because danuglipron, the small molecule from Pfizer, was completely abandoned because of liver toxicity. We saw some small little blips in the orforglipron trials for the same thing. In fact, we saw them pull back from 46 milligram, or I think it was 45 milligram dose in phase 2 to the highest dose in phase 3. And now that it's being approved by the FDA, 36 milligrams being the highest that orforglipron goes. But check this out. When you look under the hood, the doses are huge on this drug. 120 milligrams, 180 milligrams, 240 milligrams. That's massive exposure compared to the peptide injectables. And it raises a lot of questions. I don't love these small molecules. I think these are headed in a bad direction, just because I think the capacity for abuse is always there with GLP-1s, and the small molecules pose a risk that I don't think the peptides do. But all that said, while it's raising questions about long-term safety, it's always obviously for investors raising manufacturing cost issues and real-world adherence. Second, this no plateau claim, saying the weight loss curve continues beyond 44 weeks. There were visible changes late, but also you had dose escalations taking place, 90 to 120 milligrams. So is that no plateau, or is that just more drug doing what more drug does? And third, the study design, starting really low and seeing no discontinuations at really low doses, 2.5 milligrams. That's good. But there's super careful titration designs. And I think what what needs to be understood by patients here is that these phase 2 clinical trials are always designed to get Wall Street hyped, patients hyped, but rarely seem to play out the same way in phase 3. They come down to earth in phase 3 and definitely come down from there to earth from there in the real world. And so what's exciting about alaniglipron and Structure Therapeutics is it's another option for patients. It's another option to come to market to drive market competition, to drive down costs. It's an oral, so obviously it's scalable, it's highly marketable. Orals are all the rage right now. So having more powerful or potentially more powerful ones on the market is extremely promising. If you live with the chronic and relapsing disease of obesity, more options is an exciting thing. So that's what we got for this week's podcast. I really appreciate you joining us on this spring break. We've got some great plans at the family. I hope that you're doing some similar things this week. If you have a family like I do, that you're spending some quality time together. That's what we'll be doing. We're taking a little bit of a break this week. You might see some short form content. Make sure you follow us on the other platforms for that, including Instagram. We're at On the Pen Official. We're obviously over on TikTok at On the Pen Podcast. Find us on all the platforms. You can go there by clicking our link tree. You can find all of our sponsors there, as well as where to connect to us on the other social platforms. But you can check us out at otplinks.com. That's otplinks.com, and learn about all of our sponsors, learn about all the other social media platforms we're on. But until next time, we will catch you next Tuesday on the Weekly Dose Podcast. Thanks for hanging out with us for a minute today, folks. Appreciate y'all.